Hey everybody, I'm Brett Lykins. I'm a senior network automation consultant at Network to Code. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you guys about today is a tool called Nornir. Now, make sure, are the slides coming through here? I'm not seeing it.
Yep, it's perfect. Yep, I can
Oh,
see
it is.
it.
Okay, cool. Sorry. So what I want to talk about, what is Nornir? What is Nornir sort of in competition with or in complementary to in other tools in the area, some of the key concepts of Nornir, and then use cases for where and how you might use it in your day-to-day job, you know, when you might go to the toolbox and pull this tool out. So what it is an automation framework that's natively in Python. Allows you to take an inventory of hosts out on the network. Could be network devices, switches, routers, can be servers, you know, Linux server, whatever, and do things either on those hosts or against those hosts or locally in representation of those hosts. And we'll kind of cover that in a little bit. But basically, for a series of hosts, do things to those tasks, or do tasks to those hosts, I should say. So with all that said, one of the other key things about it is that it is highly pluggable, highly extensible, and it is agentless, which we're kind of compare and contrast to a few other automation frameworks. And got a link to it here. And when these slides are available, we'll have that out there too. So it's a fairly recent project in the grand scheme of things. It was first started December, about 3 years ago, a little under 3 years ago, and really hit its stride with the 2.0 release in December of 2018. And currently got about 33 contributors, a little over 600 stars on GitHub. It's definitely starting to see an uptick, especially within the network automation community specifically. And so about this point, when I'm talking to people, usually I get the question, well, what about Ansible? Isn't Ansible a Python-based automation tool or framework? And so I like to say, Nornir ain't Ansible. So one of the things that really is a key differentiator for me and why I go to it as a tool is there's no domain specific language. It's nothing about Nornir that makes it markedly any different than learning any other Python library or module. You don't have to learn a specific way of operating with it almost as its own programming language. It's all just Python. So what that means, in contrast to something like Ansible, is the logic is in code. It's not in a series of YAML files representing plays and things you want to run. Your logic to use this tool is all in code, which also means you can use any of the existing Python linters that you would like to use for that. So whatever IDE you're using, you know, you can work with Nornir, and it actually is just like Python. And then the real power, I think, comes from when you start to have problems, and every tool and every framework you'll ever start to use will run into a problem where something's not working. Maybe it's just a fat finger, maybe something wrong. You have access to all the native Python debugging tools with Nornir. So that means that you can just drop into PDB, you can use the integrated debugger in whatever your IDE is, to see the problem. When you're using something like Ansible, you don't have that kind of power and that ability to see things in real time. Now, there's 1,000 different automation frameworks and tools at this point, feels like. And so, you know, how did Nornir come about and what niche is it filling? Well, it primarily today is focused on network equipment, on switches and routers, things like that. But it also can access anything that it can talk to via SSH. You can automate with this. So any Linux box. I think there's some folks in the community working on some PowerShell plugins, things like that. It came out of the network automation community, which is why it has that focus, but it is certainly not a limitation of the tool itself. But it really sought to fill that gap where Ansible, especially circa 2016, it had really lackluster network device support. And so people started looking at ways they could do this themselves. And some of the other things in the area, like Salt, required an actual proxy host to be running or agents on the host, which especially for networking equipment, you can't install an agent on there. Cisco ships a box with widget, whatever. You can't go on there and install the Salt agent. In some cases you can now. They're starting to open up some ability for additional things like that. You can run a container on a host, whatever, but especially historically, it wasn't the case. You had no option to have an agent. You had no options for things like installing extra software on the box. It was a black box and you could only interact with it via SSH or maybe an API if you were lucky. So that's how Nornir came in to sort of fill that niche. At a high level, really break it down, pros and cons here. It's native Python tooling. It's really extensible, and it has first-class support for network devices, which really filled the niche that I needed to fill at the time when I started working with it. On the downside, and everything has ups and downs, it's a small, but it's growing, but there's a small community of plugins. And so as a result, it's less batteries included. So Ansible, being much more mature, having the backing of a company the size of Red Hat, has a lot more out-of-the-box tooling prepared and ready for it for a lot of cases. So when you go to Nornir, you're approaching it not as an out-of-the-box solution, but as a Python framework. So you do have to have that ability and that desire to dig in and understand it as a Python library, not necessarily as an off-the-shelf tool. The key reasons that you would want to overcome that, in my mind, is, like I said, number one, and why we're kind of talking about it today, is that it really easily integrates with other existing Python frameworks. So say you want to take a task that you've created to get the software version off of all of your switches and routers. It's very easy to wrap that up in a view in Flask and expose that via an API or a web app. One of the things I see fairly often starting to happen now is it can be integrated with existing Django-based apps. So Netbox, for example, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, is a very popular data center infrastructure management tool. It's open source based, it's Django-based. And one of the things that a tool like Nornir allows you to do is actually directly integrate with that Django-based web app, and you don't have to then call a separate program over here to do something else. You can use that existing web app, add some views, and have the ability to take actions on hosts. So, and I think lastly, and what I find most fascinating is that it is fast. It is extremely fast. As far as one of the things that people have always said when I talk about Ansible versus some other automation framework, I've heard this sentence said several times, that Ansible is slow because it's in Python. And Ansible is not slow because it's in Python, because Nornir sort of disproves that. Ansible isn't slow because of some of the design choices that were made when the application was created, and the way it's structured and the way it takes actions. But it's not Python's fault, because here's Nornir being several orders of magnitude faster. We want to shout out and put it in here to a guy named Patrick Ogenstad, one of the people in the network automation community. He actually did a side-by-side speed test of Ansible versus Nornir. And in the initial images on the chart, you can't even see the Nornir, how long Nornir took, because it's so small in comparison to the amount of time that Ansible took to do the same exact task. So, and speed is not necessarily everything. There's certainly cases where it doesn't matter whether it takes longer or not. So if Ansible is backing up all of your network devices overnight, it doesn't matter if it's done in an hour or 4 hours. It just needs to happen overnight. But it's definitely, an argument that I think is in Nornir's favor, that is extremely fast at doing what it does. So I'd like to go ahead and dive into the concepts of how the module and the applications are structured with Nornir, and how then we'll build on that to tie into how we could tie it into web frameworks. So at its heart, it's an inventory with hosts, groups, and defaults. And so in a hierarchical order there, you have anything that's a default setting for your inventory. You can override that at a group level. And then you have hosts with specific information that are members of groups. And so it allows you to have some granularity there, and there's also some reusability. If you have the same attribute on a device, you can put it at the default level and it applies to all your devices in your inventory. And then there are tasks. So you have the inventory and you have tasks. So tasks are those actions on hosts. And I say on, it doesn't necessarily have to be on the host. You can do a local file action related to that host. Like say you went and got all the configuration, or you got what modules were running on that server, and you want to print that to a file locally. You can do that. It happens per host, but the tasks are focused around the host usually. The nice thing about this, and really where that power starts to come in, is that these are Python functions. And what's really nice is if you can write a Python function, you can write an Nornir task. And all that is different, and we'll dive into it in a little bit here, is there's some under the hood magic that Nornir wraps around those functions to make them tasks, and to give you the benefit of the inventory handling, the thread handling in the background, the connection pooling, things like that. So Talking about inventory, there are a few different plugins out of the box for managing different sources of network device or server information. There's a simple inventory plugin, which is just a YAML data structure of devices. And we'll see that here because it's the easiest to kind of get into initially. It can read an Ansible-based inventory. It can read from a tool called NSOT. You can also read from Netbox, which we talked about a little bit earlier, which is a really common data center infrastructure management tool. You can also write your own. I come back to this, but it's very extensible, and the plugin API is really easy to use and implement. And so I've actually done 3 or 4 custom inventory plugin implementations over the last 3 years now, because it's very easy to say, well, I'm using ServiceNow and I need to talk to my implementation of ServiceNow in my own way and write an inventory plugin for that, things like that. And so I link here, there's a very good document in the Nornir documentation that talks about writing a custom inventory plugin. Simple inventory plugin that ships with it, it's the most common one that I've seen in the wild. Like I said, it's where a lot of folks start, and it's definitely simple. I mean, it's right there in the name. It's based on YAML. In general, all you need to provide is a series of a host.yaml file and a groups.yaml file to it, and in the format it's expecting, and away you go. So here's an example of a very, very simple host YAML file. And I've got just the name of the host in the inventory, the host name as far as DNS or IP, how to get to it on the network, a password or username here, and we'll see in the next, I've got the usernames actually set at the group level, and then any groups it's a member of. So in this case, it says it's an ASAV. And then you can also hang, and this is where for filtering and other purposes like that, it starts to become really useful. Hang any arbitrary data you want on the object in inventory under the data object. So you can have your own local serial number for that hardware. You can have, whatever other metadata you care about that to track, you can put into your inventory in that way. And then, so the groups file, where we called out that group that before, we give it a name, and we put some other data, say all of the things that this group attribute will be platform of Cisco ASA, they have a username of this, and they'll have this other arbitrary data item. So you can put the same things in your host or your group. It's just a matter of the hierarchy and where you want to have the hosts inherit from the groups and what have you. So with simple inventory, like I said, it's very, very straightforward. You eventually you get a problem. I wouldn't put 40, 60,000 devices into the simple inventory plugin, but for sub 10,000 devices, I've seen this work really, really well. So that's the inventory idea. So again, simple inventory is what you'll most commonly see for starting out, but there are those other plethora of options. So we talk about inventory. Now tasks is that other key component of it. So as I said, a Nornir task is really just a Python function, and it's executed against each host. So as I said, you can do it on the host, or as in the example here, you can just print something locally and it's about that host. It doesn't have to actually be something that executes on that host, which is really where a lot of that flexibility comes from. The only thing that really marks a Nornir task as different from a standard Python function is it must accept a Nornir task object. So if you only have if you have no arguments set for your function, it has to at least take the task object. And so what that does under the hood, and you can see it here, is it allows you, that task object has your instantiated inventory in there, and you can start to get to things like what is my host name, or what is my platform type. Any of the information from the inventory is on that host object at runtime, and you can access it down that direction, just task.what.whatever data. And so if you just have that, I'm doing stuff to my task. So I'm doing stuff to this host. So with tasks, you can group them inside of each other or nest them. And there's, as you get results back for given tasks, the results are nested in the same way that your tasks were called for execution. And you create your own, and that's what we did here. We created a really simple task. All it does is say that I'm doing stuff to this host. I'm doing stuff. That's all this task says. I've made a Nornir task. It's really that simple. But there are simple, common ones included. When I say simple, some of them are fairly complicated, and that's why they're included. There's a list here. We'll provide this link in the slides here. And there's a lot of things for local file operations, save a file, read a file, whatever. Text manipulation, if you want to generate something from a Jinja template, there's a built-in task to take variables and plug them into a Jinja template. There's also a lot of the common, for accessing network devices or servers, there's a lot of those common tasks pre-packaged in, so you can call those directly. Some of the where the built-in tasks are in the library, they're under Nornir plugins tasks. Sorry. And some of the really common ones that you'll see in use, if you want to send a command to a server via SSH, just commands.remote command and send some arguments in the command you want to send. And that's the task that it would execute against that host. Same for network devices. They use NetMiko instead because there's some extra handling in there because network devices are weird. Or if you want to gather some information from a network device or what have you, you can use a library like Napalm. So these are tasks that are built in and you don't have to build those. You can just call those with task.run, whatever that task name is, as an argument to .run. So got our inventory, we've got our tasks. How do we start to bring that together to run it? So one of the key things for Nornir is the initialization process. And it used to be a little bit more complicated. There's a helper function in there now called init Nornir that takes care of a lot of the under the hood, things that need to happen in order to get Nornir functional. And so you actually can just bring in init Nornir and call that. It handles the underlying object instantiation that reads your inventory, creates the Nornir object that you will run tasks on. It reads your inventory, reads your configuration, sets it up according to those parameters, and then it really just gets everything ready for the next step, which is task execution. Once you have your inventory, you have your task defined, initialize it, and then you can run the tasks. So running through init Nornir creates that instantiated Nornir object, and then also allows you to perform filtering on that, which we'll cover in just a moment here. One of the things that I see with initialization a lot is there's very flexible. You can either pass in a config file or pass parameters. Most organizations I've seen tend to use a combination of the two. There's some base parameters in the config file. We may want to override those at runtime, and you can do that. And the kind of things that you're telling Nornir about is how many worker threads do you want to use for this? Because it does use threading, which we'll cover a little bit of that in just a moment when we look at a config file. And then where are we logging to a file? What loggers are we bringing in to log? And then the most crucial thing you're passing in the configuration is what inventory plugin and how do I get to it? Because otherwise it doesn't know where your inventory is, doesn't know how to do anything with it. You have to tell it, here's my inventory type, I'm going to use simple inventory, and here's where to find it. So you have to give it that information at initialization. Here's an example configuration file. So one of the key things is the number of worker threads that you wish to use. And as time goes on, they're actually, I believe they're going to switch from just raw thread handling to concurrent futures. And so there'll be some additional improvements under the hood. But from the user perspective, it's kind of all the same. It's just a worker. And I've got this set to 100 because a lot of the times, I'm not sitting here with a 100 core box on my desk. A lot of times you're talking to something out on the network, and threads being what they are in Python, you can probably go over a little bit in this case above your core count because you're dealing with an IO bound problem. I'm talking to a net device that's 10,000 miles away. I need to wait for its response. That can take some time. So you have a lot of cycles where the CPU is just waiting. So you can actually go a little bit above your core count and get some improvements. I wouldn't put 1,000 threads at this because you're going to start to have the switching problem of wasting time switching between threads more than the benefits you gain of waiting on the IO. But anyway, well, that said, start with 100, work down, work up. It just depends on your situation, but you tweak that in the inventory. In addition, you just configure logging here. Now, you do not have to configure logging in Nornir directly because under the hood, it is just a Python library. So it is just using the Python logger module. So when you build Nornir into a more complex framework, like you've got an existing Python Flask app you want to bring Nornir into, you may just use the logging configuration that's in Flask or in your RQ worker or wherever it is, and you don't have to put this configuration in there. This is really for the initial bootstrapping and figuring out how to use the tool. You would put it in here. But if you wanted to use it in your existing logging implementation, you would just have to grab the Nornir logger when you instantiate your loggers. And then any other children loggers from Nornir that you care about. But as I said a minute ago, inventory is very important bit of information. Really, at its heart, I think this is the only bit that's required. I think there's a default core setting. You don't have to turn on logging, and you don't have to give it an SSH file if you don't want to. But it does require you tell it what plugin are we using for inventory, and then any options to that plugin, because different plugins will require different options, maybe a username and password for getting your inventory from a dynamic source, any number of things. For simple inventory, it's just, where's my host file? Where's my group file? And I don't even think you have to specify group, because if you don't want to use groups, you don't have to, but it wants those options. So you tell it where those are. And then you can also give it an SSH config file if you want to set up any proxying to get to your target hosts or anything like that. You can do all that in your SSH config file, and Nornir will read that in. So initialization itself, like I said, you can just bring in init Nornir from Nornir and pass it a configuration file. Config file equals config.yaml. And you now have this Nornir here is an instantiated Nornir object that has the inventory on it, access to start connections, all that stuff. All that's taken care of by running init Nornir. So like I said, more commonly what I see is a combination of the two styles, where there's some attributes that are passed as keyword arguments to the Nornir initializer, and then a configuration file with some of your base parameters. But either way, on the backside, you get an instantiated Nornir instance that you can do things with, you can take actions on. One of the most common tasks you'll do right after that is filter your inventory. So when you get the entire inventory of all your hosts, I have servers, 10 through 100, I have hosts, this, that, and the other. You may only want to run something on, say, your web servers, or only run something on routers in Dallas, Texas. And you have that ability to filter. So there's 3 key ways to filter the inventory in Nornir. Number one is they all rely on the Nornir.filter method. And so first is just passing in keyword arguments, saying, I only want anything in my inventory that has a data attribute of vendor equal to Cisco, or is it co-located equal to false? So you can filter on that. And what it actually returns is an instance of Nornir. So this is another instantiated Nornir object that only has those items in the inventory, but has access to the same underlying connections and things like that. So you gain some abilities. You're not having to pass this to a list and then bring it back over here. It's still an Nornir object, and when you go to run tasks, you would just run them. You do .run on filtered hosts here. So you can call out keyword arguments, or you can actually have a filter function where you've defined something to return true under a given set of conditions. And if for any host where that is true, it will put that into your filtered inventory. So I've got a simple simple function defined that will return true if any host data. So I'm looking at, for a given host that I'm passing in, look at the data on there and look at device ID. So if that device ID is in my arguments that I passed in, a list here, then it will return true, and it will add that into my filtered hosts. So when you're calling that, it's just a matter of .filter. Filter func equals whatever function you've created to perform your filtering. A lot of times that's useful when you're doing something more complex, or you need to make a call to an outside system, anything like that. There's a lot of things, a lot of reasons to use that, but it definitely allows you a lot of flexibility there. One of the other key things too as well is there's F-style filtering that'll be familiar to anybody who's worked with Django a lot. They sort of based it on that and brought it into Nornir. So you have the ability to do some more complex filtering by stacking F functions into the filtering argument there. And the Nornir documentation has a lot on that. I'm not going to dive into that too deeply here. So we've taken and we set up an inventory, we set up some tasks, we initialized the inventory. Now, how do we run tasks? What do we do? So when you want to execute those tasks in the host, it's really just whatever the name of your instantiated Nornir object is. So filtered hosts, or my inventory, my Nornir, whatever, .run, and whatever the task is that you want to execute. And so that's, when you get down to it, it's very straightforward in that way. There's not a lot of, once you have an inventory, once you have a task, instantiate Nornir and do .run. So it'll run on your inventory or the filtered subset. And what it returns is a Nornir results object, which is basically a dict-like object, and you access it by key. There's just some other special attributes they put in there around success and fail of the task for a given host, things like that. But for the most part, it's just a dictionary of here's a task that ran and here is the output. And you use that to then construct reports or whatever you want to do upstream from that. So here is an example execution of Nornir. So, sorry, all I did was I have an inventory. It's the same inventory hosts and groups file that we're kind of looking at before, really simple. I have those files, and I have the same configuration file that I just showed you a few slides back. And it is just bring in the init Nornir function, instantiate an object, instantiate a Nornir object or instance there with the config file. Define a very simple task. This will look familiar. It's the same thing, doing stuff to task host.name. And then I do my Nornir.run. And I give it the task name. And all that happens behind the scenes, it goes through, finds all the hosts in the inventory, which in this case is just the one, and then runs that task on them, which all it does is print the host name. So doing stuff to labhost.test. So the amount of code involved is actually very small to get to the point where under the hood, you could have that going out SSHing to a device, running commands, bringing those commands back, storing them in a file, storing something in Git. There's a lot of built-in plugins for managing Git workflows. So it's very powerful with the low level of effort to getting started once you have your inventory in place. Sometimes that can be a more complicated portion of it, is getting your inventory plugin created or getting your inventory into simple inventory format. But once that's the case, the actual execution and the code that lives in your application is very minimal. So that's our example execution. Kind of go through the things we talked about here because I know we kind of covered a lot of stuff. So when you're talking about Nornir, there's an inventory of hosts, and you have hosts, groups, and defaults as describing the attributes of those hosts. And you have tasks that you want to execute on those hosts or against those hosts, and there comes with a whole bunch pre-canned in. And then you can create a configuration file or just pass attributes to init Nornir to actually bring up your inventory, initialize it, and then to execute the tasks, it's just .run and whatever task. So with that said, now where are some places where I've seen this get used and some ways in which Nornir can really add to some existing tooling or help you bootstrap some tooling that's going to interact with devices on the network, be they servers, routers, switches, whatever. So example one, we've got company X bought company Y. So company X, a large shared services provider, it has a robust network automation platform. They've got tens of thousands of devices, and they're using their existing Python-based network automation platform to do all sorts of things, changes on devices, pull reports, you name it. And company X has gone about company Y, and well, company Y is not at the same point. Company Y does not have that same kind of solution in place. And so in addition to not having a network automation framework, company Y is using a different inventory store, different CMDB for their configurations, different authentication systems, all kinds of things like that. Everything about company Y is different. So that's okay. All acquisitions require some amount of meshing things together. However, a lot of the security auditors and the company X leadership expect similar experiences and results from company Y. So they want the same level of, well, I need to know all the software versions on all of my network devices. Go pull that report for me and don't come back till that's done. Or I need to know how many different Linux kernels are running on our servers, like what's our spread and who's not patched and who is. All kinds of information like that. But company Y has no way to do that. And it needs to be done on an extremely tight deadline and without purchasing any additional tooling. So, in the good, fast, cheap triangle, we've got someone cranked cheap all the way down and fast all the way up. So what do we do? Well, we use Nornir to solve this problem. So what Nornir allowed us to do was essentially take the information out of company Y's CMDB and bring it into a Nornir simple inventory format. And that was actually faster than writing an inventory plugin to talk to that other inventory store, because it allowed us to the existing CMDB had an export to CSV format. We were like, perfect, give us the CSV. We manipulated it a little bit and turned it into the simple inventory YAML format that I showed previously. With that in place, then we could actually plug Nornir into the existing Python applications and Flask-based APIs that were there, whereby a specific route or view for company Y, rather than calling some of the existing tooling, would just drop a job into a queue that would launch a Nornir inventory worker. So Nornir would launch, it would run the task, it would return the values back. And with that as the case, we're actually able to get from when we first really sort of discovered this problem to returning reports across, I think at the time it was about 8,000 network devices from company Y in just under a week. Because we were able to say, we are not going to go back to our existing tooling and today reinvent that for the integrations with the new company. We're going to take something off the shelf like Nornir that can manage inventories, talk to hosts, manage the connections, and just strap that into our existing web frameworks. And that's where we're able to go and say, I need this fast. Well, let's just use Nornir to do this quickly. And so, like I said, did that in about a week from initial to the first couple of reports we were able to generate. And it's really powerful in that way because we didn't have to figure out new connection methods to all their network devices or things like that. We just used the pre-canned ones that ship with Nornir. But because it's just a Python framework, we were able to strap it to those existing APIs. One of the other ones I've seen is you've got a company that has installed Netbox, which again, Netbox is a very common infrastructure management tool for keeping your inventory, managing what circuits go to what sites, things like that. And so this company got Netbox, they installed it, and it has all their information and they're getting benefit from that. But one of the things that they wanted to do was really start to leverage that information. Like, okay, we've got all this information. It's in a database. It's got a fancy API, a fancy web UI around it. Let's do something with it. But they weren't exactly sure how to proceed. And in this case, for this particular organization, there was a 6-week lead time on getting additional VMs and load balancers and firewall infrastructure in place. And so when they said, well, we want to stand up an API to, say, pull all device information of software versions. We'll just stick to that as a simple example. I want to know all the software versions of my routers and switches and firewalls. It was going to be 6 weeks before they could get an additional VM or this and that to put up. And in general, they were also, as an organization, unfamiliar with Python web frameworks. They had some Python knowledge, but they were not really that deeply, they did not know how to build their own Flask app or their own Django app, things like that. And so where Nornir became a powerful asset for them is that they were able to use the existing Netbox virtual machine and associated infrastructure there. And because it's just a Django app, they were able to take Nornir and deploy it as an additional view with queuing of the jobs and workers of the jobs. With all the infrastructure that Netbox is already using, they were just able to apply this as another library off of an additional view. And so it really brought down their barrier to entry so that they didn't have to wait for a whole nother set of application servers to come online, things like that. They could use their existing infrastructure, and they didn't have to really get into deeply understanding Django and understanding how that framework functioned to make a plugin to the existing web app. And so that process, they went from, hey, we've got Netbox, what are we going to do next with it, to having this plugin integrated that uses Nornir to actually talk to devices and return information. That took them about a month, which was really a fantastic turnaround time compared to if they'd just sat around waiting for 6 weeks for the server, they wouldn't have even started yet. So I think there's definitely those kind of applications where you want to talk to a device on the network, be it a router, server, whatever, and you want to provide the ability for that information to be programmatically accessible. And that's where I feel like Nornir really shines, is tying into those application frameworks, automation frameworks, I should say, that either a company is building or already exists, and providing that power of managing the inventory access and the hosts and things like that. Long way around is to how can I get Nornir? I'm sure now you want to use it. So it's on GitHub in the Nornir automation organization. It's on PyPy. You can actually just pip install Nornir in an environment, and you can go to town. It brings in some of the dependencies it needs, Napalm, NetMiko, things like that. The docs for Nornir, I can't recommend enough. They're very good documentation, and you know, they're growing all the time. There's tutorials, there's how-tos. I definitely recommend, if it's something you're interested in, taking a look at the documentation. And then on the Network to Code Slack instance, there's actually also a Nornir channel where the developers hang out. You know, people ask questions, things like that. Not on this slide, and I just realized I forgot it. There's also a discourse group, and make sure that gets added into here before these go out. But there's also a Nornir discourse page for just Q&A style stuff. How do I do this? The answer is usually on the discourse. So in summary, coming in a little bit early here, but in summary, the Nornir is a Python automation framework. And its key strengths really are that you can integrate it with other frameworks because it is just Python. You can bring it into Flask, bring it into Django. I've seen it in a Tornado app, whatever. It's able to be put into those other frameworks very easily. In and of itself, Nornir is fast. It's considerably faster than Ansible for a lot of tasks, the other well-known Python automation framework. And it is very extensible because, again, it's just Python, and all you have to do to make a task is pass that task object. I've seen people take existing functions that they have doing things for network devices, for whatever locally on the server, add the task argument in front of it, and they have a Nornir task where they did not before. And then, especially for me personally, and then the customers I work with, it has network devices as first-class citizens. They're already built in with common network device plugins. They're using they're not using custom library implementations for those networking plugins. They're community plugins. You can use the same underlying community-based network interaction library, whether you're using Nornir or not. It brings in those pieces together very well. And then it's small, but it has an active community. There's a lot of people involved in building plugins, building tools based on Nornir. And I think we're going to start to see a lot of that ramp up because I think in one of the coming versions, they're actually going to start to have sort of a registry for community-based plugins. So you can find, I need a plugin to talk to ServiceNow, and there may not be one built in, but you can go to the plugin registry and look and see, oh, there's one on GitHub. I can use that plugin to talk to whatever my inventory source is. So definitely a lot of action happening there, and a lot of things coming up in the next 6 to 9 months of growth in that area. So really excited there. And that's what I've got. So I want to thank you all for listening. You can reach out to me. I'm on Twitter, LykinsB, GitHub, LykinsBD. And yeah, just happy for the chance to talk to you all about Nornir. It's one of my my hobby horses. So thank you. Thank you very much.